Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Frances Steed Sellers, a senior writer at the Washington Post. It gives me great pleasure this afternoon to welcome two guests, Ursula Burns, the former CEO of Xerox, and Erica James, who's the Dean of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. A very warm welcome to you both.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We're very glad to have you both. Ursula, I'd like to start with you and talk about some of the very bold stands that companies have taken over issues, social issues like Black Lives Matter, climate change. Is it incumbent upon business leaders to make stances like this now?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It has always been. I just don't think that there was a feeling of comfort or support for business leaders to engage in what I call the social dynamics of the world that they live in. And right now, I think it has become unavoidable. Sitting in silence actually sounds ridiculous and is ridiculous. Employees, shareholders, communities are asking for input, support. They want to be engaged. They want a better outcome. And it's difficult if you are a large employer to be silent when every constituent that you are engaged with, or at least most of them, are requiring or asking for your point of view, your help, etc. So I think it's really important and it's becoming more natural now that businesses are starting to speak up.
Are there ever dangers of becoming too political in this very divided climate, alienating either consumers or shareholders?
But speaking up is not necessarily becoming political. This is part of the interesting conversation, right? When we speak about justice and diversity and inclusion, these are not political, at the root, political issues. They are social issues that we have politicized. So I think it's important that we kind of move away from the demonization of an issue by calling it a political issue. Obviously, it gets down to politics, but we have to start way back at the cause and the reason why we're having the discussion in the first place. When you have a business that makes a significant amount or all of its profit from consumers, and you actually don't treat those consumers equally, fairly, you don't include them in decision making, if you have employees who are not included, if you have gender or race issues, those become political issues only after businesses actually don't do what they should do as humans, right? It's not as a political stance.
Yeah, a very good point there. And Erica, maybe you can follow up on this from the point of view of the business school leader. What do you bring to this in terms of the education, and what are students bringing in as well in terms of demands of leadership as they go through the business school?
Yeah, Frances, that's such an important question. And business schools really are a conduit in this supply chain, if you will, of talent into corporate America or any business and the various sectors. One of the observations I've had in recent years is the students who are coming into business schools are fundamentally different students than what we've seen in previous generations. They are coming with the expectation that in the course of their studies, they will have access to faculty and scholarship and experiences and internships for which they are engaging in these important social matters. And I just will echo what Ursula said, that this is really a human issue. It is not a political issue. And our students are driving this topic. They're forcing faculty to engage with them in this topic. They are leading the conversations in ways that, in some cases, faculty are catching up to. But in other ways, there's also a new generation of faculty that are equally as socially minded as the students are. And so there's this convergence now in business schools where you're seeing a new crop of faculty, an incoming generation of students, and they're meeting in an aligned way, driving the curricula around matters of justice and equity.
I was going to ask you exactly about that. Has the curriculum changed? Has what is being taught changed?
The desire for the curriculum to change is definitely part of the vernacular. It's part of the ethos in business education right now. But it's a slow process. You're asking people who have become very accustomed to delivering their content in certain ways and using certain case studies and having certain examples. And we're asking them to change how they think about what they deliver and how they deliver. So that's a slow process. There's not resistance to doing so. It's just, it will take a while to get the plethora of case studies through the pipeline or the plethora of examples to be able to use. One way that we're combating that, though, is by bringing executives into the classroom to talk firsthand about challenges that they're facing right now. And the students are really enjoying those experiences. And one of the silver linings of this pandemic, and there are very few, but one is the access with which we can bring people into the classroom to engage with our students on these topics.
Ursula, as a leader, business leader, can you talk about the issue of performative allyship, the notion of people saying the right things, but maybe not following through with actions?
I mean, I think that we've grown up. You've grown up. My mother grew up. Her mother grew up with that reality that people, particularly when it gets a little bit warm in the kitchen, will mouth the right stance, the right vocabulary, but it's not necessarily, it almost always is not followed up with action, particularly when it comes to race and gender issues. We've been fighting this quote unquote issue on race for 150, 200 years, and we have had many a start. Most of them a false start to try to close this gap. Same thing with gender. I think that what's happened now is that just as positive as technology has been, or just as negative as it has been, has also been positive, in that it's kind of hard to hide behind the words anymore. It's very difficult to continue to do things kind of under the cloak of darkness and not be called for it, not be called, to the mat for it. And what people are expecting, Erica said it, what new faculty is expecting, what students are expecting, what the parents of students are expecting, is that we educate and develop the whole person, one that can actually fit in a creative way in society. And it definitely starts well before college, but it's definitely reinforced in college and in universities. And for a long time, the reinforcement was literally wealth over workers. It was capital over workers. It was all about the money, how quickly you could get it. And that was the measure. And what's happened lately, thank goodness, is that the world is opening up, particularly people who are going to be the leaders of the future, to understand that this probably is not the best way to run the railroad, right? When you can have 1% of the population literally not just own, but command wealth, power, access, and the rest of the world, the other 6+ sigma of the world, literally is excluded from those conversations. It just takes a little while for that uneasiness to start to show up in bad action, right? In an uncivil society. So I think that the good news right now is that it's not only educators, it's not only students, it's not only the people in the street, it's not even only business people. We are getting a little bit of government help here, just a little bit, because for a long time it wasn't there, where we start to realize that, we can keep doing this the way that we've been doing it, but there's not a way that anybody can see a good outcome here. There's not a way that you can continue messing around the way that we've been messing out and thinking, okay, we'll be fine. We'll be fine in 100 years if these 5 guys have all the money and these 5,000 have none. These 5 guys have all the access and these 5,000. It just doesn't work for very long. And I think that the good news is we're literally facing it head on today.
You are both such pioneers, and Ursula, that's a fantastic description of this long historic problem. Erica, look forward for me if you can. Do you see the young people you are now seeing going through business school having the possibility of changing this long-standing dynamic, actually upending the sort of racial economic disparities we have in this country?
I do. The systemic issues are deep and deeply entrenched. Nevertheless, I think we've reached a critical mass of young people who are not willing to tolerate a lack of accountability when it comes to these issues. So I think they're pushing, they're driving, they are much more savvy with how to use communication media and technologies in ways that will drive change at a pace that I think we've not seen in the past. And it's been a pleasant realization that what we're seeing is not only coming from a certain segment of the population, but people of all backgrounds are taking part in this movement, if you will. And I think that is what's contributing to a critical mass of energy and momentum that will facilitate change. Now, whether it will be weeks, months, years, decades, I don't know, but I think there's no going back from this moment.
I would agree with that. There is so little going back. It's very difficult to go back. The fundamental question is, which forward are we going to accept, right? There's a bad forward and there's a good forward, but I think that the status quo for sure is over.
Ursula, I would love to follow up on that about the role of consumers who seem, according to studies, to value purchasing from purposeful companies, companies with a purposeful mission. Can you address that as somebody who obviously has to watch consumer trends and the importance of the consumer in driving change?
Yeah, and I think it is clear if you listen to the verbiage of consumers. I'm not talking about the actions yet, but the verbiage of consumers, they are more and more aware of the companies that they are doing business with. They are more and more aware of the fact that this company is a polluter, or this company has bad or unacceptable work practices, etc. And so that awareness is good. That's the first, the first part of the solution, the first step in the solution. The question is, and I still haven't seen this quite yet, whether or not we have a sea change when the true economics consistently present that better company may cost more to deliver its goods and services than this not so better company. And I think that Erica said this, that I think we can't take our foot off the pedal here. We can't lower our expectations. Most people are reasonably smart and sensible, and I don't mean, I'm not politically aligned at all, but they don't want to crush other people to get ahead. And if we continue to present the facts, the full story of the facts, to get that cheaper garment, to get that cheaper whatever, to get access to this, you're destroying whatever you're destroying. I think that consumers will be more likely, if we are consistent, to actually make the choice for the whole good versus for their immediate selves. Even though over the last 4 years, I have been shocked at how I have been proven wrong in that theory, that people will go for the better, I'll take a little bit more pain if we can get access to a lot more things for a lot more people. But I'm hoping hope is not a strategy, but I'm hoping this is an anomaly or aberration, because we have not presented ourselves well, particularly in America, over the last 4 years.
I'd like to ask you both about employee well-being, and starting with you, Erica, is there a business argument for having employee well-being programs in terms of employee retention and things?
So there's definitely a business argument for having employee well-being, right? Because it is the employee base that allows for organizations to deliver on its mission. And if we don't nurture and care for the employees, then the ability to deliver that mission, to deliver the product or the service is weakened. So whether it's a specific program or not, some programs might work better than others. Some might be more costly than others. But I think fundamentally, and this goes back to something Ursula said earlier, we have to think about this as a human issue. And when we engage and lead and manage and motivate and support and nurture our employees as human beings, whether that is in an interpersonal relationship or whether that's some large-scale organizational policy, each company has to figure that out for themselves. But I don't think there's an option not to care about the employees' well-being at this day and age.
Ursula, of course, the pandemic has brought this all into highlighted all these issues about well-being for employees. How has it affected the way corporate leaders think about their employees and their well-being?
Yeah, I mentioned this earlier. For a long time, our system valued capital over workers. It valued machinery over work. And I think what's happening now is that we are more and more aware that there is a top stop, an upper limit where you can use and abuse employees. There's an upper limit when they become not your ally, but they become your enemy. And I don't even mean an active enemy. They become a disgruntled, non-contributory member of the family. And I answer this question a lot, and people ask me for business cases, and this is not a business case issue. It's just wrong. And there was a time when we worried about these kinds of things just being wrong. So it's just not right. I mean, these people contribute. These employees, they are the company. If there was a way, trust me, to get a right to do your business without employing any of them, most people would have done that already. You need them. We need them. They are the value creators for just about every single enterprise. And it's no longer, can you give me a wellness program? Can you show me the return on the ROI of that? It's like, if we make the employees more sticky, more interested, more passionate, more creative, there is nothing at all wrong with any of those words. Even if it took us another 10 minutes out of in their lunch break, there's nothing wrong with that. And so I think thinking about it from a business case perspective actually minimizes the pervasiveness of the impact of employees on business.
A couple of questions for you both about diversity. Erica, we know that diversity is important in the workplace, that it's good for the bottom line. Why are so many companies still run by white men?
Well, that's the question of the century. Honestly, that's the case because we've allowed it to be the case, because we've not made people accountable for thinking more expansively when they consider talent and what they're looking for and where they go to seek that talent. And it is clearly not, I've said this in other engagements, we've not prioritized looking for diverse talent and supporting and nurturing diverse talent. So until that happens, we'll continue to see the same kind of results that we've been seeing. And the other thing I would say is there is a level of fear still associated with diversity, both in terms of not knowing necessarily what to do, how to create more equitable and fair and diverse environments, but also just talking about it in general. And until we get to the point where we're able to communicate effectively and productively around sensitive matters like diversity, if one thinks of that as sensitive, then we're not going to achieve the kind of results that are possible. And we're going to continue to see segments of the communities not getting opportunity, and we're going to continue to not see talent being leveraged as maximally as it can be.
Ursula, I think we have time for just one last question, and I'd like to ask it of you, and that is about Ros Brewer. You two are such trailblazers, and now we have another Black woman coming along. She'll take the helm of Walgreens, but only the third Black woman to lead a Fortune 500 company. Why has it taken so long, and how significant is this?
It's massive, and I'm going to do a massive shout out to Roz. She's a friend, and I am unbelievably proud and so happy to no longer be the only. Oh, the only. It's kind of like people said that was a good thing. I'm like, really? I mean, how would you like to be the only anything? But the reason why, think about the world. Erica said this, but we have a world structured and built on the backs of people, Black people, women. This is how this nation was built. There's a supremacy structure in this country still that has white men at the very top of that structure. And so you have white men, then maybe you can have a push between white women and Black men. You have Latinx floating in there. And at the very end of this conversation, if people think about it, maybe in a break, you say, oh my God, we have these Black women as well. We are a small percentage of the population. We are stereotyped by every group, like every other group is stereotyped as well. And the supreme structures in this the structures of supremacy in this country, political structures, educational structures, business structures, have been in existence from the time that this country was started. So to actually think that it's going to kind of change very quickly, I think it's silly thinking. It's going to take, as Erica said, work. We're going to have to absolutely nurture at every level. We're going to need the white men who think that they own the positions, they own the boardroom, they own the CEO spots, they own the heads of universities, they own the media. They don't own anything. They happen to be the people who are in the seat today, but we all own it and have a right to it. So everything, and we have to stand up as Black women, as Latinx women, as Latinx men, et cetera, to say, no longer, guys, no longer, we should participate. We should participate. I mean, by the way, this is not, as I say all the time, I'm not against white men. I just want us to be included. Can we just be included in the conversation?
Right. Ursula Burns, Erica James, thank you both very much for joining me. I wish we had more time, but I'm afraid we have to finish now.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Erica, I'll come out to visit you. Invite me.
It was fascinating to hear you both. I'll be back shortly with Warby Parker CEO Neil Blumenthal.
Hi, I'm Kelly Collis. According to a recent survey from the Washington Post Insight Team and Citrix, when it comes to wellness, most will exercise, eat nutritious food, and get plenty of sleep to achieve well-being in their personal lives, but few think of the impact it will have on their work lives. Today, it may be more critical than ever for leaders to face well-being challenges head-on for their employees to thrive. This afternoon, I'm pleased to be joined by Donna Kimmel, Chief People Officer at Citrix, and Dr. Amit Sood, Executive Director of the Global Center for Resiliency and Wellbeing, to talk about how we can build a healthy workforce of the future and why it is essential to think about well-being at work. Let's start off with Dr. Sood. What are the risks if companies ignore well-being or say that's something people need to manage on their own time? Can we really separate work from well-being?
That's a great question, Kelly. You'll lose good people if you neglect well-being. See, we don't have two brains. One brain I leave at home and the other brain I bring at work. So helping brain be stronger and more focused helps both your personal and professional life. Essentially, when people come to work, they're bringing their cognition and emotion. Cognition is your attention, judgment, decision-making ability, and emotion is your access to uplifting emotions, meaning, passion, drive. right? So most well-being programs train both cognition and emotion, all the good well-being programs. So when you're offering a well-being program, you're actually essentially training skills that your employees need to perform effectively. So neglecting that is you might lose the good people, and the good people who stay with you may not engage as much with work.
Now, Donna, you've been hearing the perspective from the C-suite about corporate purpose and why it's so important. But let's focus on a key component of a healthy, successful company, employee well-being. What are some of the most common employee well-being needs, and how can companies address them?
Yeah, this is a really important question. I'd just love to build on what Dr. Sood had just shared. I think ultimately we all know that talent and people matter in an organization. It's talent that truly drives the success of any business. And many leaders really now incorporate a talent-first approach into their culture and values. Employee well-being needs really have changed over the years. I think we all know that we have focused in the past very heavily on physical health, and though we still do that, offering gyms, healthy snacks, that sort of thing, we also know that there's more of a focus on mental well-being. And as we've all come through the pandemic with a lot of uncertainty and volatility, clearly we need to make sure that we have strategies that help our employees manage anxiety, manage feeling overwhelmed, or feelings of loss or loneliness. We need to continue to help build resilience and stamina. And I think some ideas of things that companies can do to help, provide this bridge, I think first and foremost is really to make sure that we give permission to talk about it. We need to stop the stigma around mental health or not talking about wellness by enabling those topics to truly be part of the dialogue. We also need to make sure that we're providing easy access to counseling. And we want to make sure that we're offering programs, just as Dr. Sood was talking about, that promote mindfulness, such as meditation and yoga. We also can teach managers and coworkers how to have conversations about mental health so that helps eliminate the stigma when people get comfortable with it. There are programs out there that teach it. There's one that we use called Mental Health First Aiders. It's been terrific for us globally. Organizations, I think, also can make sure that they help employees think about interweaving their personal and professional lives and needs. We're in a culture now where always on boundaries really are blurred. We think about we don't really have commuting downtime anymore. There's caregiving, constant caregiving that's happening if you've got children or elder care. So I think as companies think about additional ways that they can help their employees with this balance, it's looking at helping them block time that they need potentially during the day, making sure that they're taking vacations, helping to manage workloads and priorities, providing technology that creates ease versus complexity in their day. I think another area is flexible hybrid work, enabling employees to choose when and how they work, as long as we're able to continue to maintain productivity and outcomes. And I think another area is really looking at our customizable benefits. The U.S. Department of Labor came out with a statistic, a pretty alarming one, that during COVID, women have been leaving the workforce 4 times the rate of men. And that really causes us, I think, to step back to say there's really no such thing as one size fits all. It's really looking at the individual needs and the differing needs of our employees. So I think ultimately there are so many companies out there doing creative things that help bridge wellness into their workplace. And I think ultimately it's thinking about all of our health and well-being needs, physical, social, spiritual, financial, as well as emotional, as we really design whole person employee experiences.
Well, I want to get back to Dr. Sood. We are kind of winding down our segment today, but I want to get a few more thoughts real quick. You've written, when facing adversity, people can do more than cope. They can grow and they can rise. What advice would you give people that feel like they can barely hold it together?
Well, I've been in the resilience space for the last 20 years, and I cry every month, if not every week. So if you have it together, you're doing great. As a response to adversity, you could either become disrupted, reintegrate, or grow. Those are the 3 options. We know that disruption is not a good idea. Reintegration is good, but you actually want to become stronger at your weaker parts because of the adversity. So we have no choice but to grow. But at this point, I think, and you know that crying actually helps immunity. It helps your immune system. So if you're someone who cries to bring that laughter in the end, I think that's healthy. And there's nothing to feel bad about it.
Donna, to close out our segment today, you've experienced the workforce rise together despite the continuous strain of the pandemic. What would you see in the future, in the coming months? What practices will you keep? Will you get rid of? Will you strive to kind of incorporate in the next year?
Yep. So again, I think really quickly, again, to tie what Dr. Sood has said, one, we want to keep caring for our colleagues. It is about our humanity. It is about making sure that we recognize the whole person comes to work. So first, I would definitely keep the experience of connectedness that has happened during the pandemic. I would ditch really thinking about the typical employee and coming back to understanding we need to customize, we need to understand what's important to individuals. We've had a peek into everybody's lives in their homes during the pandemic, and that has given us a sense of what people are grappling with. And I think really in terms of what we're striving for is to move a lot faster towards creating cultures where employees can ask for and get the help that they need to be their very best. Because every single employee wants to come in every day and be the best that they can be in terms of helping a company be successful.
Thank you both for joining me. That's all the time we have today. Now I'd like to turn it back over to the Washington Post.
Welcome back. If you're just joining me, I'm Frances Steed Sellers, a senior writer at the Washington Post. My next guest is Neil Blumenthal. He's the co-founder and co-CEO of Warby Parker. Welcome, Neil.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're delighted to have you. So part of your founding mission has been the buy a pair, give a pair mission. How did that become part of your founding mission, and how does it work in a competitive marketplace?
Sure. I think companies decide to do good in the world because founders themselves are employees, and we want to work at companies that have broad impact. So when my co-founders, Jeff, Andy, Dave, and I were thinking about starting Warby Parker, right, we thought that it was an inherent good to charge $95 for prescription glasses instead of charging $400 or $500, right? We were trying to solve our own problem when we would go into an optical shop, get excited about a pair of glasses, and then walk out feeling like we got ripped off. So while we knew that that was inherently good to bring down the prices of prescription glasses in the US, we still knew that there were hundreds of millions of people around the world that didn't have access to glasses and couldn't afford $95 glasses, for example. So we thought, how can we best serve that population? And one idea was, hey, let's commit a % of profits or a % of revenue. We ultimately decided against that because if we weren't running the company, we thought that those numbers could be manipulated perhaps in the future. And ultimately, what was impact? Impact was getting glasses on the faces of people who needed them. So we committed to provide a pair of glasses for every pair that we sell. So now we give ourselves, roughly a year from when we sell a pair of glasses to make sure that we get a pair of glasses on somebody's face who needs them. And I'll tell you that it motivates me to come to work every day. And it's one of the main reasons why people come to work at Warby Parker. And we've now distributed over 8 million pairs of glasses to people around the world and here in the US.
So how unusual do you think your company is with that kind of mission? I know that the Business Roundtable in 2019 said that companies need to operate for the benefit of stakeholders, from customers to shareholders, and of course employees. Is it broader than Warby Parker?
Yeah, I think when we started the company in 2010, it was pretty rare, but I think increasingly more and more companies are realizing that their missions are to give back to the communities in which they operate. And some of this, frankly, is driven and more prevalent in the tech sector. So Warby Parker lives within the tech world, within the fashion retail world, within the healthcare world, within the social enterprise world. But particularly what we've seen in the tech sector is a pretty tight labor market, particularly for software engineers. And when you're competing for talent, right, you want to create the best working environment possible. And there's nothing better than having a mission that's going to improve the world. So I think we've started to see that with some tech companies, and it's spread. So if companies needed to rationalize, which I don't think that they need to, but if they wanted to rationalize doing good in the world, they could do it as part of their HR strategy and how they recruit and retain talent.
I can't resist asking, having just spoken with Erica James from the Wharton School, and of course you're a graduate of the Wharton School, is this an ethos you found among fellow students when you were coming through the school, and do you think it's broad among business school students now?
Absolutely, and it's certainly core to the culture at the Wharton School. You know, when I think about my classmates and what they've gone on to do, in fact, many are entrepreneurs. Whether it's our classmate Joey, who started Allbirds, right, the sustainable footwear brand, or our friend Matt Polson, who started Omaze, that uses sweepstakes to raise money for causes around the world, or other businesses that provide elder care. So it's core to the culture at Wharton, and we're seeing it at more and more business schools, which is great because frankly, businesses are having more impact on all of our lives than at any point during human history. And in some ways, businesses are starting to fill certain roles where government should, but isn't. So one example is around voting, right? In the US, it is really difficult to vote, and it shouldn't be. But because there are political incentives for one party, for example, to have fewer people vote, and for another party to have more people vote, right, there are incentives for whichever government is in power to make it more difficult to vote. And then it's incumbent on businesses to make it easier. So whether that's providing paid time off or providing information on how to register to vote, right? These are things that businesses can and should do.
So let's talk a little bit about finances as well. Over the recent decades, wages have risen only slowly, and CEO salaries have shot way, or compensation has shot way, way up. Should there be some sort of rebalance in that dichotomy?
You know, inequality is not good for anyone. It's not good for business. It's not good for the health of society, right? It leads to less happiness. It leads to less innovation. And we see a lot of the growth in inequality start during tax changes that came into effect in the 80s. So one of the things that we could do to help reduce inequality is look at our tax structure. And, you know, I know this came up during your last session, but just how we tax capital versus how we tax wages, for example.
Right, and then to bring us right up to date, how have the demand of the crisis over the pandemic and then racial injustice changed the demands of leadership? How have they altered the way you think about your relationship with your employees, your shareholders, and your customers?
So I don't think it fundamentally changes how I think about all those stakeholders, but it was certainly a very trying time being a leader in times of a crisis. And that's where leadership is either shown or falls by the wayside. And during a crisis, right, you need to over communicate, you need to lead by example. This was another situation where it appeared like the government, in particular the federal government, was slow to react to this pandemic. You know, Warby Parker, we primarily operate in the US. We have a presence in Canada. Our supply chain extends to Europe and Asia. In November, we were looking at the pandemic as a supply chain risk, right? That we thought it might impact our frame factories in Italy, China, and Japan. And not being global health experts or infectious disease experts, we weren't thinking as much, oh, is this going to come over and suddenly become more of a consumer risk or a risk to our employees? Sure enough, it did. And as soon as it did, we took fast action on Friday the 13th in March. We made the decision to close all of our retail stores. We were one of the first national retailers to do that because we were flying blind. We didn't have good data on where the virus was, how it was being transmitted, but there was a risk towards employees. And as a leader, your number one priority is the health and safety of your team. Now, for most business leaders, right, that even though it's a number one priority, it's not something that is all-consuming because the risk to health and safety is pretty de minimis, depending on the industry that you're in. Enter a pandemic, and suddenly, right, there's massive risk, and you have to figure out how to protect people. And in our case, it was sending people home from work. We continued to, pay our store teams, for example, until the CARES Act was passed, and we did analysis that showed, hey, we could furlough employees and they would still receive comparable wages thanks to the government support that was being offered. Now, we also sort of guaranteed our team members that if they didn't receive comparable wages based on the CARES Act, then we would indeed make them whole. But these are decisions that all executives were faced with, and I think we can look back and see, hey, which companies performed in the interests of their stakeholders and which didn't.
So we had a Wharton professor, Adam Grant, on Tuesday this week, and I'd like to read to you something he said and ask if you agree and what you think it entails. He said, the COVID-19 crisis may inspire a movement towards more ethical, compassionate leadership. Employees will demand it. Do you agree with that? And what does that mean in terms of taking actions?
I hope so. I think, again, sometimes it's dependent on the state of the economy, and for certain skill sets, right, labor is mobile, and it's more mobile than it's ever been in the history of the world. So for those individuals choosing where to work, right, they can prioritize those companies that are mission driven, that consider the stakeholders, whether it's customers, employees, the environment, the community at large. And certainly these past 12 months, we have a bunch of examples of companies that rose to the occasions and those that didn't. And I think also, what we saw in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder was also, indicative of, hey, are companies acting in a performative way? That I know that you discussed that earlier in the last session, or is this genuine desire to create change, but putting resources behind it? And what we saw, there were a lot of companies that were really fast to issue statements. And then what you saw on social media, right, because now, right, access to information is so widespread, and everybody has a voice that can be quickly amplified, is that we saw employees at many of these companies that issued these statements say, hey, you're saying this, but you don't live it every day. And I think that was a wake-up call to a lot of executives and businesses that say, hey, you got to put your money where your mouth is. And that money where your mouth is not just a donation. It's looking internally and seeing, hey, what can we do as an organization to fight systemic racism? What can we do to create a more inclusive and diverse company?
So instead of asking those questions, tell me exactly what you can do to create an anti-racist environment in a company.
So one of the first things that you could do is publish your diversity stats, right? You shine a light on things, and that immediately starts to result in accountability. Now, diversity is almost the last step in the process, right? You can't create a diverse organization if you don't create an inclusive organization. So there's a bunch of places to start there. One is on the hiring front. Right. For example, we provide training to all of our hiring managers on inclusive interviewing techniques, right? And we provide training on unconscious bias. So that way we can reduce unconscious bias in the hiring process. We work to create a more inclusive organization by focusing on microaggressions, living our values, creating ERGs, and ensuring that all voices are heard, and constantly reevaluating our processes and policies to ensure that they are indeed inclusive.
And how do you make sure employees know they're being heard when they have raised issues about diversity or perhaps the pandemic?
So for one thing is to ensure that executives meet and speak with team members irrespective of their seniority. So, one of the things that my co-founder and co-CEO Dave and I did was go on a listening tour and meet with a lot of our Black employees in particular. And one of the things that we learned was that there was more microaggressions at Warby Parker than we thought there were. So as we thought about different trainings to provide, we doubled down on trainings around microaggressions. So whether it was a Black female engineer who in our pantry was given a plate because a white employee thought that she was part of the facilities team. Right. And one of the things that we saw was one of our core values is to assume positive intent. And on the surface, this is a great core value. And one of the reasons why we created it, presume positive intent, was that so we could have intellectually honest discussions, right? We could debate ideas, but we don't want to debate people's motivations or intent, right? Everyone's at Warby Parker to create a better world, to provide vision to the world. But what we found was that at times when somebody had committed a microaggression, like the example I just mentioned, they might fall behind, well, I didn't mean to. And, one of our core values is presume positive intent. And that's not the way to use that value. So that's something that Dave and I spoke very openly about to the team. Like, that's not acceptable. When you make a mistake, right? If you were to step on someone's foot, for example, your first reaction is, I didn't mean to. No, it's, I apologize. Are you okay? Is there anything I can help you with? Before you get into intent. And it's sort of the difference between intent and impact. And these are the conversations that companies need to be having right now.
So as you have tried to build a diverse and inclusive workplace, you've tried these various strategies yourself, but what has not worked? Have there been issues you've come up against where you've realized things have not worked?
It's hard to point to a specific policy that I would say has not worked. When I look at Warby Parker, it's not as diverse or inclusive as I want it to be. So in that case, I look at the last 10 years and say, yeah, there's definitely things that we could have done better. And hopefully we're on that path now.
And you have changed, I think, your meeting times to accommodate working parents. What can companies do to better accommodate the needs of working parents, particularly in the pandemic, when women have hit so hard and often having to manage childcare as well as their jobs?
Flexibility is the name of the game for everybody, but particularly for parents in the midst of this pandemic. So we're trying to create policies so that way there is more flexibility in terms of time when somebody is working. And the most important thing is to have voices in the room sitting around the table when you're making these decisions. So, early on in Warby Parker, right, we started Warby Parker. I was, roughly 30 years old. I think a lot of the people around the table were in their 20s or early 30s. We would have our executive team meeting at like 8:30 in the morning. It wasn't until we had a parent on the executive team that said, hey, you know what, this is the worst possible time because this is the time that I'm dropping off my daughter to school. So that was a really easy change to say, oh, let's just move the meeting from 8:30 to 9. But you need to have diverse perspectives around the room to ensure that policies and processes that are being created and norms are indeed inclusive.
And you have increased your efforts to increase employee well-being. What have you learned about what people need, apart from flexibility, which is, of course, huge, going through tough times like this?
So one big thing is increased communication. So I would typically have a weekly all-hands meeting. And now we do it twice a week. So that way we're constantly sharing information quickly and people feel connected. One of the other big things is around mental health resources. In general, I think the U.S. has underinvested in mental health care, and companies as well. So getting supplements to health insurance plans. This is a really difficult and stressful time. And companies need to be supporting our team members.
I have time for just one question, and I'm going to ask a question that was sent in by one of our viewers. This is from Maggie Pauline in Virginia, and I read it to you. What's your advice for engaging with employees when everyone is remote? Tips for how to lead virtually.
So it can be really challenging. The best thing to do is constantly be switching it up. And I think there's this belief that, hey, we should be on Zoom or on Skype or on Google Meet 24/7. And that's not necessarily the answer. It is good to be able to see somebody, but frankly, it's exhausting being on 8 to 10 hours of video conferences because frankly, there is actually increased cognitive load because there's a slight delay between the video and the audio that one hears. And there's some research that shows, and actually you mentioned Adam Grant earlier, Adam Grant shared this with me, that shows that humans can better deduce emotion audioly as opposed to visually. So you actually might have some better conversations just over the phone than through a video conference. But one of the things I would suggest is more frequent but shorter calls and meetings, and also more skip level meetings, and just trying to find ways and excuses to connect with one another, right? In the office, you have all these serendipitous collisions when you walk to a meeting or you run to the bathroom, and you need to create that in a remote setting.
Well, thank you very much for joining us both by video and audio today, Neil Blumenthal.
Thanks for having me.
We were delighted. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., my colleague Jonathan Capehart will be back to talk with reporters and columnists about the big stories of the day. So don't miss that on Washington Post Live. I'm Frances Steed Sellers. Thank you so much for joining us today.